Uh, can you see the screen?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So I think this will be the last session for sonography. So we'll be dealing with different aspects of ultrasound. So the first is ultrasound in trauma. So initially it started as focused examination in only the abdomen. So it started as the FAST exam, that is focused abdominal sonography for trauma. In this, only the abdomen was usually scanned initially. They started in early 1990s. And then in this abdominal scan, only the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, and the pelvis was scanned for any abdominal bleeds. Later on, a different approach for all the trauma-based scenarios was done, and this was named as EFAST. So this is extended focused assessment with sonography in trauma. In this, they've also included the assessment of the lungs and heart in addition to the abdomen. So there are many studies which were published. So this is a meta-analysis which was published recently, which suggested that EFAST helps in diagnosing of pneumothorax, pericardial effusions, intra-abdominal free fluids, and also with a very good sensitivity and specificity. If you look at these sensitivities, you can see it is almost 69% sensitive in case of pneumothorax, and specificity is 99%, whereas in pericardial effusion it is 91%, and intra-abdominal fluid it is 74%. So this has become a new modality of detecting hemorrhages in case of any trauma patients. So how do we do this EFAST examination? So by using the EFAST examination, we can appreciate any free fluid collection in case of the abdomen or in the thorax. Also, we can diagnose cardiac tamponade as well as pneumothorax. But the main limitation with this is we can't localize which organ the injury has occurred, and also if there is any free air in the peritoneum, we won't be able to visualize the organs properly. So these are the few limitations which are associated with EFAST. But with EFAST, we are able to diagnose a lot of hemorrhages, hemoperitoneum and all, pneumothorax and all, with very rapid timeline. So that appropriate intervention can be taken. So how do we perform the EFAST? We make the patient lie in the supine position. We stand on the right side of the patient. We use our probe on the right. We use the probe using the right hand, and then we have the screen in front of us, and we use the left hand to operate the USG machine. So what type of transducers we can use? We can use the phased array. Phased array is the one which we use for cardiac examination. Also, curvilinear can be used, but the main issue is with curvilinear, we won't be able to appreciate the heart waves properly. So phased array would be a preferable one. If we don't have a phased array, we can still go ahead with the curvilinear probes. So the preset which we use on the USG machine is we can use fast exam preset, or the normal routine abdominal preset which we usually use. So with the help of EFAST, we can diagnose if there is any fluid in the abdomen, if there is any fluid in the thorax, if there is any fluid in the pericardium, and also we can diagnose pneumothorax. So ideally, whenever we are performing EFAST, we should make sure that we follow a sequence, so that if we don't, since there are many different views in this examination, we should follow a sequence so that we don't miss out on on any examination, on any finding. So this is one proposed sequence. You can establish your own sequence, but make sure that you visualize all the fields. So ideally, your probe should be in at least 4 positions, as shown in this, in 6 positions as shown in this figure. So one would be your right upper quadrant. The second is the left upper quadrant. Third is in the pelvis. Fourth is in the cardiac, and 2 fields in the lung for visualizing the lung. So we need to place the probe at least in 6 positions. So this is EFAST. So how do we perform? So first, coming to the right upper quadrant. In the right upper quadrant, we place the probe marker towards the head of the patient, and then we put it in a mid-axillary line. So we place the probe on the mid-axillary line, and the probe marker is towards the head. So what do we visualize? What do we see if we put the what do we see if we put the probe in the mid-axillary line on the right side? So we have the diaphragm here. So we can visualize the diaphragm here, and then we have liver here somewhere. So this is the place where the liver is visualized, and we have the kidney in the posterior part. So we have the kidney here. Between the kidney, right kidney, and the liver, there is a fine area which is known as the Morrison pouch. If there is any fluid collection, we can appreciate the Morrison's fluid in the Morrison's pouch. Also, if you can see here, we can visualize the lung above the diaphragm. So if there is any pericardial, if there is any pleural effusion or any hemorrhage in the pleural cavity, then we can visualize the fluid in this area. We'll come to the pathologies and see once we will just finish off all the views, and then we'll see how each pathology will look like. Okay, so how do we look at the left upper quadrant? So for viewing the left upper quadrant, we put the probe in the posterior axillary line. In right upper quadrant, we were putting the probe in the mid axillary line, but in the case of left upper quadrant, we put it in the posterior axillary line, and we put the probe marker towards the head. Make sure usually the spleen is slightly posterior, so that is why we put the probe in the posterior axillary, not in the mid axillary line. And also make sure that the probe should be placed so posterior that your knuckles are touching the bed. That is just so that we can visualize the spleen properly. So your probe marker is towards the head. So whatever we visualize from left to right will be from the head end to the foot end. So we have the diaphragm here, and above this we have the lung, we have the spleen here, and then we have the left kidney. So any fluid collection in this area will come in the perisplenic area. So this is regarding the left upper quadrant. Now, what about the pelvic view? So left pelvic in the pelvic view, we have two different probe positions. One is the longitudinal. In the longitudinal view, we put the probe marker towards the head end, and then we put it above the pubic symphysis. Since bone does not conduct any, if you can see here, we have the pubic symphysis. Since bone does not conduct any sound waves, we put it above the pubic symphysis, and we view it in an inclined angle like this. So if you can appreciate, the probe is slightly tilted towards tilted down. So we visualize everything in this plane. So whatever we see here from anterior to posterior, we have the bladder above. So this is the bladder, and then we have the prostate here, and then we have the rectum here. So any fluid collection in the rectovesicular space will signify hemorrhage in case of any trauma patients. This is in case of male pelvis. But in case of female pelvis, we have the bladder here, we have the uterus, and then we have the rectum here. So any bleeding will show a fluid collection in the rectouterine pouch, or this is also known as the pouch of Douglas. So the same thing, we have the bladder here. We can see the uterus here. This is the uterus, and we have the rectum here. So any fluid collection in this area will in the rectouterine area will signify hemorrhage in case of traumatic patients. That was about the longitudinal position. Now coming to the transverse plane, we put the probe marker towards the left. So we can visualize the bladder above, and then we have the uterus in case of females, and then we have the rectum posterior. So any fluid collection in the rectouterine area, that is the pouch of Douglas, signifies bleed. And again, in case of males, we have the bladder here, and posteriorly we have the prostate, and then we have the rectum here. And any fluid you can appreciate in this figure here. So we have the bladder here, we have the uterus, and posteriorly we have the rectum, and any space between this is the rectouterine space. And if there is any fluid collection here in the pouch of Douglas, it will signify a hemorrhage in case of trauma. In case of male pelvis, we have a bladder here, we have the prostate posteriorly, and then we have the rectum here, and space between them, the rectovesicular space, hemorrhage, we can find fluid in this. Next, so we have looked at the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, and also we have looked at the pelvic view. The next view is the cardiac view. So cardiac view, we usually perform two views. One is the subxiphoid. We've already dealt with this in the cardiac QSG. So we put the probe in the subxiphoid area with the probe marker towards the left side of the patient, and then we visualize the heart. So if we visualize the heart, we have the left ventricle here, we have the left atrium, we have the right ventricle here, and we have the right atrium. So this is the liver above, and we have the pericardium, which is the hyperechoic area. This hyperechoic area is the pericardium. The next view for cardiac is the Plaques view. In Plaques view, we put the probe marker towards the right shoulder, and we put the probe on the second, third, or the fourth intercostal space, and then we visualize the heart. So we have the left atrium below, and then we have the mitral valve, then we have the left ventricle, we have the aorta, and we have the aortic valve here, and we have the right ventricle above. So in case of any pericardial effusion, there is fluid collection between the pericardium and the heart here. So cardiac, we perform two views. One is the subxiphoid view, and the other one is the Plaques view. Now coming to the lung view. So lung view, we perform at least one view on both the sides. So for normally, if we put the probe on the anterior position, we can visualize the movement of the lung. This is known as the curtain sign. We've already seen it before, or the lung sliding sign. If we put an M mode here, we visualize we can visualize the seashore sign, which we've already dealt in case of while we were discussing about the lung ultrasound. So what are the different pathologies which we see so that we can identify hemorrhage in the case of critically ill patient who had a trauma or who had a history of fall? So when we put the probe in the right upper quadrant, in the mid-axillary line, we should visualize the liver, and then we should visualize the right kidney. What if there is any hemorrhage? Then we visualize a hemorrhage between the liver and the right kidney. So this is the Morison's pouch. So if there is any fluid collection in the Morison's pouch, in a case of any trauma patient or any injury or any history of fall from height, then we should ideally think of any hemorrhage. These patients should be taken in for surgery as soon as possible without even waiting for CT scan if they are unstable, because this fluid will is obviously a hemorrhage in case of any history in a case of road traffic accident or a trauma patient. The same thing, we can visualize the liver here, and then we can visualize the right kidney here, and then we can see the fluid in the Morison's pouch. So this is case of fluid in the right upper quadrant. Now, what about fluid in the pleural cavity? So if this is the diaphragm and this is the liver, we have the right kidney here, and this is the lung above. So any fluid in the lung will be seen like this. If the spine is visible, usually the spine is not visible since air is not a good conductor. So we usually get A lines here. But if we can see the spine, that means there is a fluid collection here. So this is known as the spine sign. So if there is any fluid collection in the thoracic area, we can visualize the spine. Next, coming to the left upper quadrant view. In the left upper quadrant view, we put the probe in the right, in the left posterior axillary region, and then we can visualize the spleen. We have the left kidney, we have the diaphragm, and then we have the lung. So as you can see here, in this perisplenic area, we can visualize fluid. So this is the left upper quadrant view, visualizing fluid in the perisplenic area. Now coming to the pelvic view in the longitudinal, in the pelvic area, in the longitudinal view, in case of male, so we have the bladder here, we have the prostate, and then we have the rectum here. So in the rectovesicular space, we should find some fluid. So we have the bladder here, and then we have the prostate here, and then if you can appreciate, we have fluid in the rectovesicular space. So this is this signifies bleed in the abdominal cavity. Next, coming to the to female pelvis, we have the bladder above, we have the uterus, and we have the rectum behind, and then we should look for fluid in the uterine area. So as you can see, we have the bladder here, and then if you can appreciate, this is the uterus. This is the uterus here, and we have the rectum behind. So this is the fluid which is between the recto-uterine pouch or the pouch of Douglas. So this signifies bleed. Now coming to the subxiphoid area, we visualize the left atrium, we visualize the left ventricle, right ventricle, and right atrium. Any fluid collection, fluid collection in the pericardial region, will signify hemorrhage in the pericardial cavity. And as you can see, the diastolic is there is diastolic dysfunction as well. So this could be a case of cardiac tamponade as well, even in this condition. This is the plaques view, the probe marker towards the right shoulder. We can appreciate the left atrium, the left ventricle, and the aorta. Between that, we have the aortic valve, and then we have the right ventricle here. As you can see, there is fluid in the pericardial region. And also in this case, there is right ventricular, there is left ventricular diastolic dysfunction. So there is cardiac tamponade in this condition. Okay. So coming to the lung view, this is the normal lung sliding. And then if you can appreciate, there is no lung sliding at all in this. So this is absent lung sliding. So if in the normal lung, if you put an M mode, we get the barcode, the seashore sign. But in case of in the case of a pneumothorax, if you put a M mode, we get something which is known as the barcode sign, which we have already seen in a lung ultrasound. Also, in case of pneumothorax, we visualize lung point, where lung point is a point where there is a point of differentiation between the normally aerated lung and and part of the lung which has pneumothorax. So this is the lung point, which we've already seen in lung USG. So what happens in case of a pneumoperitoneum? As we've already seen in physiology of USG, air does not allow the ultrasound waves to pass through. So they usually create A lines or the reverberation artifacts. So whenever there is air, you won't be able to visualize a part of the view properly. So these A lines is known as the enhanced peritoneal stripe sign. So if we find this enhanced peritoneal stripe sign, that means there is pneumoperitoneum. So in this case, there is pneumoperitoneum in the abdomen. So if you get a patient, a trauma patient, if he is stable and you have done a fast, then and if the fast is negative, that is there is no fluid collection, then we can do serial e-fast examinations to see if there is any fluid collection. If you are still in doubt, you can get a CT scan done. But if the patient is stable and fast is positive means that there is some fluid collection. Since the patient is stable, we can get a CT scan done to see if to recognize to demarcate the site of bleed, and then we can take him up for surgery. But if the patient is unstable and fast is negative, then we should still go ahead and get a CT scan done. But if the patient is unstable and if has fast positive, then we should directly take him up for the operating room to perform laparotomy and then decide where the bleeding is occurring, so that we can save a lot of time and also prevent massive hemorrhages. So this is about trauma in USG. So again, we have different views. One is the right upper quadrant view, the left upper quadrant view, the pelvic view, the cardiac view, and the lungs. So we'll appreciate the whole of the abdomen and the thorax as well. And we are looking at fluid collection, and we are trying to see if there is any hemorrhage, fluid collection in these different parts of the body. So this is about e-fast. The next PPT is about vascular access. Okay, so as an intensivist, you might have been putting a lot of central lines and difficult intracats as well. So using ultrasound has become a new this thing. So where we are able to put central venous lines with very minimal effort. So we'll just look at some of the anatomy before we go into how to put a central line. So if we are trying to place an IJV, central line in the IJV, so we have the sternocleidomastoid muscle here, and then we have the clavicular head here, and we have the sternal head here, and in between this there is a triangle. So if you can see in this triangle, we have the common carotid artery, and on the lateral side we have the internal jugular vein. So this is the position where we can put in the IJV line. Okay. So if you put a probe in this area, and the probe mark, we usually stand at the head end. So we are usually standing on at the head end. So the probe marker should be facing towards your left. So the probe marker is on this side. So we have the common carotid artery on the medial side, and we have the IJV on the lateral side. So as you can see, this is the common carotid artery, and this is the and IJV. So the common carotid artery is usually circular, and IJV is in different shapes. As you can appreciate in this, we can see that the common carotid artery is pulsatile. The common carotid artery is pulsatile, but whereas IJV is not pulsatile. And the flow is also pulsating in this. If you can see, the flow when the color Doppler is put is pulsating. But in IJV, it is a continuous flow. So how do we differentiate between arteries and veins? Arteries are usually non-compressible with light pressures, and veins, they usually compress even with light pressures. And arteries will have thick echogenic walls, whereas veins are thin, and arteries are usually round shape. Veins can be a variable shape. As you can see, it is not following any contour in this in this picture here. Arteries are usually pulsatile, but veins are not pulsatile, and they just have a constant flow. So whenever we put a color Doppler, we get it does not, and we put a color Doppler, and if we compress the artery distally, then there is no change in flow. But in case of vein, if we compress the distal area and we visualize this part of the IJV, then we can appreciate increased flow in that region. So there are two different types of approaches while inserting the central line. One is the longitudinal plane, and the other is the transverse plane. So longitudinal plane is you go along the side of the transducer, and in this case you go beneath the transducer. So as you can appreciate in this picture, we can see the vein gradually going in and coming out. But in case of a transverse plane, we will be able to visualize the needle, but we won't know if it is the tip or not. So, so what do we ideally do if we are approaching we are using the transverse view? We initially start with the angulation, and while we advance this needle, we gradually tilt it backwards so that we will be able to keep trace of the tip all the time. So what we can do is we can measure the distance between the skin and the and to the center of the IJV. By this, we can estimate the depth of the depth of the internal jugular vein from the skin. And depending upon the angle of inclination which we are using, if it is 30 degree or 45 degree or 60 degree, depending on that, we can decide since we have already calculated the depth, we can also calculate the distance the distance which we can go to hit the vein. So this is how we go in the transverse fashion. And as you can see, we can see the needle in this picture in case of the in the IJV. If we put it in the longitudinal view, we have the IJV here, and we can see the guide wire once it is passed. So even guide wire can also be visualized in case of IJV. This is the longitudinal approach. So I'll show you a video where we have put a central line using the central line in the IJV using the ultrasound. This procedure can be done using an assistant as well, but here we have done a single user IJV insertion. So in the first few seconds, so we've already taken preparation for insertion of IJV. Now we are visualizing the IJV here. So as you can see, we have the IJV here, which is compressible. So once I'm pressing the once I'm putting some pressure, you can see that the veins are collapsing, but we have the artery which is not collapsible here. So in this, what we are doing now is we are trying to infiltrate lignocaine as a local anesthetic. So as you can see, the vein is collapsible, but the artery is pulsatile and it is not collapsible. So we have put the IJV on the center of the screen, and we are trying to infiltrate at the same position, that is at the center of the probe. So we have infiltrated lignocaine now. now we are again trying to visualize the IJV. Okay, so if you can see here, we have the IJV on the center of the screen and the common carotid on the medial side. Now, if you can see, there is a slight disturbance when I'm trying to insert the needle here. So this is how you visualize if you are going in the same direction or not. And once you have inserted your needle, go slightly deeper, and as you can see, there is a backflow here. So soon as you achieve the backflow, we insert the guide wire, and then you look at the ECG monitor and see if there is any rhythm changes. As soon as you see any rhythm changes, or if you feel that you have gone enough deep with the guide wire, you remove the needle from there. Now we are using the dilator to allow us put the central line. Now this is the last step where we put in the center line. So as you can see, the whole process has the whole process from beginning from lignocaine infiltration till the insertion of center line did not require more than 2 or 3 minutes. And also, if you can see, the whole procedure was bloodless. So even a single drop of blood was not wasted during this procedure. So ultrasound is a very good modality for us to use for insertion of center lines. And one more thing which we can do, whenever we put in a central line, we are always in a dilemma to see if to know if the central line is in the IJV, or did we hit the artery, and are we in the common carotid artery. So we always have that dilemma. So how do we decide if you are in the IJV or if in the common carotid artery? One thing is we look at the blood and we can see if it is an arterial blood or a venous blood. That is one thing. But in case of any septic shock where the SvCO2 is very high, in case of any hyperdynamic circulations, or if the child is in hypoxemic state where even the arterial blood is is looking like venous blood, in these conditions we won't be able to differentiate between arterial blood and a venous blood. So in those cases, what we can do is we can do a PBG or an ABG and then see the SO2 levels and then decide if it is in the IJV or in the EJV, sorry, in the common carotid artery. The other thing is we can do an X-ray and see how the central line is going, and then we can decide. The other most easiest way which we can see to confirm if your central line is in the IJV or not is by performing a 2D echo. So by performing a 2D echo, what we do is we put the probe in the apical 4-chamber view. So if you put the probe in the apical 4-chamber view, we can visualize the left ventricle here, and then we have the left atrium here, and we have the right atrium, and we have the right ventricle here. So what we do is we take a syringe with 5 ml of NS, and then we push fluid through the central line, and then we visualize for any bubbling that occurs from bubble that enter from the right atrium to the right atrium to the right ventricle. If you can see at this position, there will be a slight bubbling change. So this change in this bubbling will indicate that you are in the IJV. I'll just show you those bubbles again. So as soon as we instilled saline into the IJV, we can visualize bubbles. So this means you are in the internal jugular vein. I'll show you the bubbles again. So these are the bubbles. So this is how you can confirm if you are in the IJV or not. Okay, so what about subclavian vein? So the procedure would be the same. So we'll just look at the landmarks for different approaches. So we have the brachial vein, we have the basilic vein. Both of them will combine to form the axillary vein, and then a cephalic vein and the axillary vein will continue to form the subclavian vein. If we use a transducer, what we do is we usually start in the mid clavicular line, and then we go laterally like this with the probe marker pointing towards the right shoulder. So in the first view, we can visualize the subclavian vein, and then we have the subclavian artery here. So the subclavian vein here, and then we have the subclavian artery here. If we go a little bit back, we can visualize the axillary vein and the axillary artery and cephalic vein. Both of them will combine to form the subclavian vein. And then if we go still posterior, we can visualize only the axillary vein and the axillary artery. So a position between between 1 and 2 is a safe place where we can put a subclavian central line, where we can visualize the subclavian vein. Now coming to peripheral axis, peripheral IV axis in small children, we know that it is very difficult for us to put in an IV cath. So we can use the same ultrasound probe to visualize the veins, and then we can put in IV cannulas. So as you can see, we have the vein here. We can put a slight pressure on this, and we can visualize the vein collapsing. And then we can keep gradually inserting the needle, and then we can even visualize the tip of the needle. But what about arterial canalization? So for putting radial artery for invasive BP monitoring, for constant sampling, we can put in an IV cannula into the radial artery. So the same thing, we can visualize the radial artery. The radial artery is usually pulsatile and it is not compressible. By that way, we can visualize the radial artery, and then we can put in the IV cannulas. Next is the brachial artery. So as you can see in this picture, we have the brachial artery here. Then we have the femoral approach to the femoral vein. So we have the femoral vein, the femoral artery, and we have the femoral nerve here. So we have the femoral vein approach here. Now coming to the dorsalis pedis artery, if you want to put in IBP set to the dorsalis pedis, we can have a dorsalis pedis artery here. So this is about the vascular axis. Next, we'll be looking at ocular ultrasound. So imagine you have a 3-year-old child, 5-year-old child who's got with severe fever, multiple episodes of seizures, and you're thinking there is ICP, raised ICP. So how do what we usually do is we ask the ophthalmologist to come and look at the retina and then comment about papilledema. But we know that the changes of papilledema will take at least 48 hours to occur, and maybe sometimes we won't get an ophthalmologist who is available on call. So we can do an ocular ultrasound to diagnose if there is any raised ICP. So how do we perform an ocular ultrasound? So in the eye, we have the retina here, and then behind the retina, we have the retinal vessels, that is the retinal artery and the retinal vein, which is going within. And then surrounding the retinal artery and the retinal vein, we have the optic nerve, and surrounding the optic nerve, we have the optic sheath here. So we have the optic nerve, and we have the central artery and central retinal artery and the central retinal vein between it, and surrounding the optic nerve, we have the optic sheath. So whenever we put an ultrasound on the eyeball, we can visualize different structures of the eye. So we have the anterior chamber, we have the lens here, we have the posterior chamber with the vitreous, and we have the optic nerve here, and we have the retina. So this is how we visualize the eye. So there are two approaches. One is the horizontal approach, and the other one is the longitudinal approach. We usually use the transverse approach with the probe marker towards the left. So how do we look for papilledema? So for looking for papilledema, what we usually do is we try to make sure that the optic nerve is in the center of the field, and then we will have to also visualize the optic nerve sheath. So as you can see, this black area which is visible here, the whole black area here is the optic nerve. So this is the optic nerve area, and then the slightly grayish area on either side of the optic nerve is the optic nerve sheath. Okay, so we have the optic nerve and we have the optic nerve sheath. So what usually is the anatomy of the optic nerve? So why are we looking at this optic nerve sheath diameter to determine the ICP? So if you can see, we have the retinal vessels in the center here. That is the central retinal artery and the retinal vein. On the sides, we have the optic nerve, and surrounding this optic nerve, we have we have a space which is known as the subarachnoid space. So this subarachnoid space is in continuation with the subarachnoid space in the brain. So any CSF changes that occur in the subarachnoid space will be transmitted to the subarachnoid space between the optic nerve and the optic nerve sheath. So as you can see in this picture, on the left side we have the central retinal arteries and central retinal veins. Surrounding it, we have the retinal, we have the optic nerve. Surrounding the optic nerve, we have subarachnoid space where the CSF is flowing, and surrounding the subarachnoid space, we have the optic nerve sheath. So if there is any increase in the intracranial pressure, this increase in the intracranial pressure is even transmitted to the cerebrospinal fluid, which is present behind the eye. So this will result in dilation of this CSF space. So the nerve sheath is pushed away and the retinal vessels are also compressed. So this is what happens when there is raised ICP. So in case of a normal ICP patient, we have the optic nerve, we have the arachnoid space, and then we have the optic sheath surrounding it. So when there is raised ICP, there is increased in the CSF pressure. Since the optic nerve is a solid organ, it does not undergo much of a compression. But since there is increase in the CSF pressure, this will push off the optic nerve sheath away from the optic nerve. So we have a dilated optic nerve sheath here. So this will indicate raised ICP. So what we do is we visualize the optic nerve in the center, and then we visualize the optic sheath. 3 mm away from the posterior part of the retina is the most bulging part of the optic nerve sheath. So this is where we usually measure the optic nerve sheath diameter. So what we do is we put the probe in the transverse position, then we measure 3 millimeter from the posterior part, and then we mark it. And at this level, we measure the optic nerve sheath diameter. So this is how we measure the optic nerve sheath diameter. What we do is we measure 3 millimeter away from the posterior area, and then we measure the optic nerve sheath diameter. So depending upon the size of the optic nerve sheath diameter, we are indirectly measuring the raised ICP. So there are different studies which were done to quantify the size of the optic nerve sheath diameter to call it a raised ICP. So there are different studies which have mentioned that size of around greater than 5.3 millimeter will indicate an ICP of more than 20. And some studies have shown a size of more than 4 millimeter also shows a ICP of more than 20. So so what we can usually take is ONSD, which is greater than 0.45 to 0.55 or 4.5 millimeter to 5.5 millimeter, 3 millimeter away from the posterior area will indicate intracranial hypertension with an ICP of greater than 20 millimeter of mercury. So optic nerve sheath diameter, which is greater than 0.45 or 0.55, will indicate raised ICP. So the same thing in this picture, as you can see, we have measured 3 millimeter away from the posterior area, and then we have measured the optic nerve sheath diameter at this point. The optic nerve sheath diameter in this case is 0.64. In this example again, we are measuring 3 millimeter away from the posterior area, and then we are measuring the optic nerve sheath diameter at this region. As you can see, it is 0.76. So all these are indicating a raised ICP. Also, in this picture, as you can see, there is slight bulging of the optic disc into the posterior region of the eye. So this is also indicating this disc will also indicate raised ICP, signs of raised ICP. It is similar to papillary. So this is about ocular ultrasound. The next last part is about lumbar puncture. So it is quite easy to perform lumbar puncture in case of a pediatric population. But what if you have a child who is obese and it is very difficult for you to perform if the child is very big? So what we can do is we can use an ultrasound to insert the lumbar puncture needle. So what we usually use is the midline approach. So whenever you look at the whenever we are trying to put this lumbar puncture needle, we usually pass through the supraspinatus ligament. We have the interspinatus ligament, we have the ligamentum flavum, and then we enter into the CSF space. So as you can see in this, to visualize the CSF space, we use a curvilinear probe. By putting a curvilinear probe, we are able to look at the bones, the spinous process here. So we have the spinous process of one vertebral body here, and we have a spinous process of other vertebral body here. So in case of adults, if we are performing it, we usually put it at L4 and L5 area. In case of pediatric population, we usually look at L2, L3 or L3, L4 areas to put in the spinal needle. So what we can do is we usually take a skin marker, and then we put the probe in the longitudinal fashion, and then we extend a line above and below the probe after visualizing the spinous processes. And then we visualize the interspinous area. So what we do is we mark a line away from the probe, and then whenever we have the interspinous process in the center of the screen, then we put a line on the horizontal area as well. So in the center of this, when we are at the interspinous space, we mark a horizontal line. So we remove the probe and then we attach all these lines, and then we come at a common intersection. So this is the point where put in your spinal needle. Also, we can estimate the depth, how much depth we'll have to go to enter the CSF space. So by measuring this, we can also estimate the approximate depth which we'll have to enter to obtain the CSF. So this is about lumbar puncture, and this is about USG in critical care. If you have any doubts, you can put it on this. You can put it in the chat group.
Incredible work, Sandeep. I think the session over 6 sessions, we have concluded the entire ultrasound in critical care. What lines, insertion of lines has been taught, right?
Yeah.
So we will be inviting fellows for our rotations in our hospital at Hope, where me and Dr. Sandeep we are working, and those who are interested can show their interest by sending a message to me or Dr. Sandeep. I'll be sharing his number on the group in case you have doubts, you wish to ask any kind of clinical doubt as well. So feel free to talk to him, as well as you can talk to me in case you feel I will be of help. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Sandeep, for taking out time and teaching us.
Thank you.
Take care.